Okay. Good evening, everyone who joined to Marx School today. On behalf of Marx School, I warmly welcome you all. And today is our 53rd Marx School. Unlike most of our previous programs in Marx School, today's discussion will be held in English language because our resource person today is from overseas. He's from Italy. Actually, we had some sessions earlier in English language, and after a quite long time, we will have another one today. As Professor Sumanesiri said, after the speech of comrade Maurizio, we can have a Sinhala translation or brief Sinhala translation on what he talked in his speech, 15 minutes, but it will be done by Professor Sumanesiri. Okay, so let me introduce comrade Maurizio Coppola. Maurizio Coppola is a member of Potere al Popolo. I don't know, I'm right there in pronunciation, which means in English, power to the people, which is one of the leftist political organization active in Italy. He is co-responsible for international relations there, and he works as a freelance translator and a journalist in Italy also. In this discussion, he hopes to talk on the topic, economic crisis, war, imperialism, and left in Europe, with an extension of an alternative reading on Ukraine conflict. He will critically analyze those phenomena, war, imperialism, and left in Europe, economic crisis in the context of Russian-Ukraine war. Prior to going to this speech by Maurizio, I would like to kindly request you all from the comrades in audience to keep your microphones mute while comrade Maurizio is speaking. It will be comfortable for all of us. He will take about 55 minutes, about an hour. Then we can move to our discussion. Prior to the discussion, as I said, Professor Sumanesiri will give some explanation in Sinhala language too. It will be helpful for all of us. Then I think we can have a speech from Maurizio. I would like to cordially invite you to take your opportunity and do a speech here in Marx School 53. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mahesh, for this introduction, and thank you all for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to participate in here. I hope that my speech will not be 60 minutes. I really hope to make it briefer, so we do have also enough time to have a discussion. Yeah, my introduction will focus on of course, on the ongoing war in Ukraine, view from a European point of view, European continent, and I will try to confront the empirical facts that we can observe today and in the last 2 years with the historical and theoretical approach developed by Lenin in the past, of course. This is really, I really try to bring together what he developed, his ideas, his analysis, also the political implications, above all in the publication of 1915 that is called Socialism and War. It's a pamphlet he wrote after the meetings that took place in Switzerland between 1911 and 1914, in Basel, in Zimmerwald, and so on, all the peace conferences in which practically the Second International broke, and the Third International, after that, the Third International was created, exactly on the question of war. This is the reason why I think it is important and interesting to start from Lenin. So I start with the starting lines also of the pamphlet of Lenin, and I quote his passage. He's saying, "Socialists have always condemned war between nations as barbarous and brutal. But our attitude towards war is fundamentally different from that one of bourgeois pacifists and of the anarchists. We differ from them, from the former, in that we understand the inevitable connection between wars and the class struggle within the country. We understand that war can not be abolished unless classes are abolished and socialism is created. And we also differ in that we fully regard civil wars, that is, wars waged by the oppressed class against the oppressing class, as legitimate, progressive, and necessary. We Marxists offer from both the pacifists and the anarchists in that we deem the necessary historically from that standpoint of Marx's dialectical materialism to study each war separately. So the elements that are really important in this quote is the connection between wars, the external wars, and the class struggle. So Lenin is saying there are two things that cannot be separated in the analysis and in the historical process. And then also a critique of a general condemnation of war, because he's saying, as Marxists, we have to analyze, make an analysis of the concrete situation of war. So he's saying there are some progressive kind of wars. There are wars that, and we will talk about that later. But there are, of course, also wars in which we have to intervene, to condemn them, to fight them. So we know that history never repeats itself. This is also very important. We have to start also from that point of view. So we have to study each social fact separately. But the reference to Lenin remains important. In fact, a common momentum, we can compare the situation of Lenin and the situation today is like Lenin, we are today, like in Lenin's times, we are today in a deep crisis of capitalism. We have a very imperial and imperialist character of the armed conflict today. And of course, also the fact that the left is tending to opportunism. That means that running behind their own national bourgeoisie in the so-called defense of the fatherland. So these are like the common moments we today live with Lenin, but there are, of course, also big differences. And we need to highlight them. There are above all two. On the one hand, objectively, we are living a stage of capitalism which is much different. There is a very high integration of capital globally, which means a higher complexity of today's capitalism too. That means that if we want to measure globalization, imperialism, and so on, we can not do it in the same way Lenin did, or not with the same tools. We have to adapt that. And the second big difference is also like subjectively, from a working class point of view, it's the lack of both a strong labor movement that can in a way articulate peace and socialist revolution, and the socialist organizations able to organize and unite the working class internationally. If the political consequences of Lenin during World War I could be summarized in the slogan he used, convert the imperialist war in a civil war against the national bourgeoisie, today, the situation is much more complex. And of course, it would be anachronistic and also a little bit superficial to just retake slogans that were valid 100 years ago today. So in this complexity, I want to deepen 3 points now in this introduction. The first thing is I want shortly draw the general explanations for the war in Ukraine we can find today, and frame them theoretically and critically. So how are we reading about war? How are the mass medias and the people in power talking about war? The second task is looking a little bit better and a bit concreter in the situation in Ukraine in order to give an alternative explanation for the character of the ongoing war. And the third point will be to present a little bit also the political positions inside the European left and indicate some tasks for a revolutionary approach today. So for the first point, so what are the different general explanations we can find in Europe, but not only in Europe, all over the world, I think. There are mainly three. The first one, it's like a more psychological or individual approach on war. The main argument is that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia responsible for the invasion of Ukraine, is a fool person. Like his madness of one person produced war. There were no objective reasons for making war, but his foolness, his madness brought to the Russian invasion. And that means also the political consequence is also very interesting when we hear about this kind of explanation. That means that, first of all, there are no social structures in our world. Our world is only composed by individuals, and individual decisions lead to social change. There is no idea of like a relation between structure and agency. And above all, the political consequences. If there is only one person responsible for war, Vladimir Putin, so it means that, in fact, we can eliminate this person, this particular person, and we can stop the war. And this is, in fact, what, above all, warmongering governments and medias are explaining to us. Today, the war can only be ended with a military defeat of Putin. This is what they are telling to us. My question is, what lies behind this kind of explanation? Of course, there is, from a Western point of view, from the US, from the NATO, there is an idea of regime change in Russia. So there is an idea that we have to replace Putin to have like a much peacefuler world. But of course, there is also something different that we have to, and this is still in the argument of the ruling class. We have to enable Russia in a way also to confront China as the bigger opponent in this global relations, global international relations. So this is one way of explaining the war. A second explanation that is coming a little bit from the opposite political spectrum also, it's the argument that there are only defensive reasons for Russia to intervene in Ukraine. So Russia wanted to denazify Ukraine, so weaken the Nazi organizations and groups, above all at the border of Russia in the eastern part of Ukraine, the so-called Donbass. But there is also the explanation that Putin is defending the fatherland against the immorality of the West. If you look at the last intervention also of Putin, he's accusing and attacking the West for their liberal approach, for their immorality, for the fact that like individual rights are given to women, migrants, LGBTQI people, and this is something that we have that Russia is in a way fighting, because these are all immoral laws. But also that we have to look closer to what is happening really. So we have to confront this kind of explanation with the empirical facts. And I would say that there are a few elements that prove the falsity and the hypocrisy of the view that the idea of the defense of the fatherland against fascism and immorality can be justified in the present war. We should talk about Donbass. We will not do it about the eastern part of Ukraine. All the history since 2014, above all, with this a territory that counts around 7 million people, with a majority of Russian-speaking people, with also a presence of far-right groups from Ukraine, with a kind of armed conflict that was developed since 2014, when the Russian-speaking population refused the transition that was going on after the Euromaidan and so on. So this is a very particular thing. The fact is, and what I want to highlight is the question: did Russia really support the separatist movements in a point of view of denazification and of social progress in this territory? And I would say no. First of all, because there was not real investment of Russia and of Putin in social development in these territories. I do not know of money spent for public education, for public hospitals, and so on and so on. So it was like a conflict that had different reasons. And above all, the argument of denazification does not correspond to the developments we are seeing in Russia under Putin in the last years. There is a tendency of authoritarianism, of authoritarian turn in Russia, of a reinforcing also of fascist groups inside of Russia, and the arrest of opposition groups, of leftist groups, of communist groups, attacks against attacks on the rights of women, migrants, LGBTQI people, and so on and so on. So there is no such a thing as like a social advancement and the denazification of Russia. So we have also really to put in question this kind of argument, of this kind of explanation of the war in Ukraine. And with that, I come to the third way of explanation, of a general trend of explanation. It's much more like a general economic and geopolitical reason of the war. So it is the argument that, in a way, the US and NATO want to expand in the East because there is like this imperialist tendency of the West and the US imperialism above all to expand and to limit the possibility of resisting of emerging powers like Russia and China. And but what is the geopolitical and economic initial situation there? I think it's much more complex than just to say that there is like an US expansion. Of course, there is this element, but the complexity is really deep. We have, for example, Europe. If we speak about, or from an European point of view, Europe is in the middle of a triangle between China, Russia, and the US. Europe is literally stuck between these three countries. But why? Europe developed in the last years concrete relations with all the three countries. You have, for example, with China, there is an increasing commercial and industrial relation that is going on. Some countries signed even the Belt and Road Initiative of China, of course, with a very a rapid reaction also by the US, putting pressure on the governments that wanted to be integrated in the Belt and Road Initiative. But there is also like this link with Russia. Russia became one of the major energy supply for Europe. So there was, in a way, also the industrial development of Europe was linked to Russia. Germany above all, but also Italy were the main countries dependent from Russian gas. Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2 are the concrete facts also that show this link between Europe and Russia. But there is still a dependency also from the US, the dependency from the US capital, but also politically. Nothing happens in Europe without the blessing of the US, and also military, because there are still hundreds and hundreds of US and NATO military bases in Europe, with a hotspot in the Mediterranean Sea. And this is the reason also why Italy has such an important role in this conflict, because it is strategic region geopolitically. So the US, the explanation of this kind of argument is that the US intervened in order to disconnect Europe from the dependency of energy supply from Russia and from the ongoing commercial integration with China. For that, NATO expansion in the East is used as an instrument to put pressure in Europe. So if we look only on that side, of course, we can say there is something like that. There is, in a way, a geopolitical and imperialist reaction of the US in that way. But it also is not highlighting another imperial side. For example, can we speak about the Chinese imperialism? Can we speak about the Russian imperialism? I think these discussions would ask a discussion by itself. But I think that we can say that Russia, even if it is not an imperialist country, at least it has some imperial visions of Putin that we can see also in the discourses he is leading since 1.5 years. He's speaking about rebuilding the Tsarist empire. He's seeing also Ukraine as an important economic field to conquest the coal industry, heavy industry, but also the hyper-fertile soil that provides high yields are a target for Russia today also. So there is we cannot only say that there is a US and NATO expansion in the East. There is also at least an imperial tendency of Russia. So also this explanation is not enough to understand what is going on in the war. It gives elements, but it is not enough. And with that, I want to pass on the second point. So how can we now develop an alternative reading of the ongoing war? And I think for that, I want to make a short step back and get back in the explanations of Lenin about the historical differentiation of wars since the French Revolution, because he's saying, okay, there are there are different characters of wars, from the Great French Revolution to the Paris Commune, so from 1789 to 1871. There was the bourgeois, progressive, national liberating character of wars. the defense of the fatherland was a legitimate, progressive, and just cause. So there were like wars that were liberating the oppressed from the feudal system. And this was a kind of progression. The bourgeoisie freed itself, and with that, put also like in a new social relations, the proletariat and the working classes. So it was like a war for the kind of liberation. But with World War I, he's saying, and here I quote again Lenin, formally progressive capitalism has become reactionary. It has developed the forces of production to such a degree that mankind is faced with the alternative of going over to socialism, or of suffering years and even decades of armed struggle between them. Between the great powers of the artificial preservation of capitalism by means of colonies, monopolies, privileges, and national oppression, or of every kind. So he's explaining that World War I is not anymore a kind of progressive war. In opposition, in contrast, it is like a colonial occupation and oppression. It is an imperialist expansion, and so on and so on. So he's characterizing this kind of war with 3 points. He's saying war is used to fortify the enslavement of the colonies, so like to stabilize slavery in the colonies. Secondly, the World War I is used to fortify the oppression of other nations within the great powers. So there is a way of inter-imperialist oppression in this war. And the third characterization of the war is war to fortify and prolong wage slavery and divide the international working class. So there is also a social war inside of this World War I. And if we continue to analyze also the following wars all over the world, World War II, the Cold War, the National Liberation Wars, we can identify like there are like some wars that are progressive, just, and in a way legitimate. For example, I think about all the National Liberation Wars in Africa, in Cuba, in Algeria, and so on and so on. So there is like this kind of war, but of course there is also reactionary wars. For example, World War II was concretely a reactionary war. It was like fascism was a response to the increasing force of working class in Europe, and the war between like the West and Nazism and Nazi fascism was also a response from the US against a new imperial power that was developing, Germany, of course. And then also by bombing Hiroshima and so on, it was also a way to show that there is no way that also the East can develop independently in the sovereign way. So there are all these characteristics of the wars. So we have to look at like the characterization of the situation today for having like an alternative reading of the ongoing war in Ukraine. And for that, I want to present shortly like what Emiliano Brancaccio, an Italian economist, using like left Keynesian approaches, is explaining the war today. I'm using this author Emiliano Brancaccio because I think, not because I think he gave the ultimate explanation of the ongoing war, but I think there are some important elements we have to capture, and I try to present them now. Just to explain, he and other leftist economics made a call, an international call, published some months ago in 3 languages, in the three main newspapers, in English language in the Financial Times, in French language in Le Monde, and in Italian language in Il Sole 24 Ore. There are all like very important bourgeois newspapers, but it offers like a reading that is important. So what is Emiliano Brancaccio saying about this war? He's saying, in summary, that like this war is a capitalist war. He says that we need to recognize that the contradictions in the deregulation of global economy and the global economic system have made geopolitical tensions more acute. What does it mean, the deregulated global economy? He's like highlighting different moments of this deregulation. Of course, it starts with the crisis in 1974 that is leading us to the 80s. So we have like the neoliberal turn after the oil crisis. all over the world, but we have also like Reagan and Thatcher that came in power in the US and in UK. But we had also like in more peripheral countries moments of this neoliberal turn. For example, we had the coup d'etat in Turkey, where a left revolution, a socialist revolution, was oppressed by fascist forces and by the army linked to the fascist forces. And we had also like working struggles and worker struggles that led to defeats, like in Italy, that initiated like this neoliberal turn. Then a second moment of this neoliberal turn was made in 1989, 1991, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of Soviet Union, and the opening of the Eastern world for private capital investment. So this was a second moment of the deregulating tendency over global economy. And then, last but not least, like in the years in the 90s and 2000s, like the introduction and the implementation of global free trade agreements, the liberalization and privatization of the markets, above all of the financial markets, that reinforced the dominance of US capital globally and the US capitalism, imperialism globally. So Brancaccio is saying we need to recognize these contradictions, that the ongoing contradictions are like the result also of a crisis of the regulated global economy, because this global opening, this global opened and deregulated economy created an imbalance in economic relations, in which in this free market globalization, with like the US, the UK, and other Western countries having today large external debts, and China and in some extent also Russia having external credit positions. So the consequence of this imbalance since the crisis of 2008 is that there is a tendency to export Eastern capital to the West, not only in form of loans, but also in form of acquisitions, leading to a centralization of capital in Eastern hands, above all in Chinese hands. So what we are seeing now since 2014, since 2008, but more concrete since 2014, 15, and so on, is the strong reaction of the West, above all of the United States, that they passed from a deregulated globalism to a policy of so-called friend-shoring. That means like a protectionist closure against goods and capital from China, Russia, and much of the non-aligned East. So the EU has been joining this American-led protectionist turn, and this form of protectionism exacerbates international tensions and creates favorable conditions for new military clashes. So Brancaccio is concluding by saying that the conflict in Ukraine and the rising tensions in the Far East and the Middle East can be fully understood only in the light of these major economic contradictions, like of this general law of centralization of capital that leads to also war situation. So he's using also like Marxist terminology, Marxist concepts to argue and to understand the war. And I think that this kind of explanation is helping us to understand it better than the other three arguments and ways to understand war. But I also think that there is like a way of economic determinism in these explanations, as if the agency of people, the political decisions made by governments are not playing a role. Of course, there are like general laws of tendency inside of capital, but you also have to recognize that there are agencies. There is the working class, there is the bourgeois class, so there are political decisions that are producing the historical development of history. So this is the reason why we need to get back again. What is going on exactly in Ukraine? These were, like Brancaccio is explaining us, is giving us indications for like general tendencies, and we need to get back to the concrete situation in the Ukraine. And with that, I want to introduce a concept that for me, and I think for us in the discussions also in my political organizations, we are speaking about that. It's like the paradigm of war economy that is getting dominant all over the world. And with war economy, we should not only understand the way of making war, of leading war external wars all over the world and globally, but also like a kind of cultural and social answer to the crisis we are living today. And I want to highlight a little bit this kind of discussion with the next point. So what does war economy exactly mean for Ukraine? There was an article published by Michael Roberts a couple of weeks ago with the title Reconstructing Ukraine. And Michael Roberts is explaining in very concrete ways how the West is now using the situation of war in Ukraine to implement, to enlarge also like the influence of Western capital in the territory of Ukraine. So there were two official meetings with corporate leaders and governments in 2022 in Switzerland, in Lugano, and in 2023 in London. And Michael Roberts is saying that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is now a planned invasion of foreign capital and multinationals in Ukraine once the war is over. So there was like the Ukraine Development Fund created and launched during these meetings between the Ukrainian government and corporate leaders and governments and global governments. And this fund that should be finance the reconstructing of Ukraine is led by BlackRock and the JP Morgan. So one of the most important hedge fund of the US and one of the most important US banks. So there is like very concrete, the dominance of US imperialism now in Ukraine in the idea of reconstructing Ukraine. The World Bank estimates that after 1 year of war, the costs of reconstruction are about 2 times the Ukrainian GDP. So we are speaking about after 1 year of war, about $411 billion of the value of reconstructing Ukraine. And of course, now after 1.5 years and even more, we can even imagine that this is doubled. This sum is doubled. So Michael Roberts is saying there are like 2 real aims of this reconstructing Ukraine. The first is like that the foreign capital investment should be enforced in Ukraine in the form of the transformation of the Ukrainian government in a special economic zone. In special economic zones, there will be no social regulation. So they imagine a country free of trade unions and the labor rights. Already today in Ukraine, with the beginning of war, the government of Zelensky introduced or abolished labor law. So the agency of trade unions are very limited. The working hours do not have any limit anymore. So the people working day can be forced to work even 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And what they want also to introduce in this special economic zone is like a severe business tax regime, so to enforce foreign business and these investments that should be then protected by the public. So there is like the foreign investment that should be then protected and guaranteed by the public. So Michael Roberts is explaining that the wartime state of emergency greatly helped the government's ability to implement an anti-social agenda planned before the war. So the way of deregulation of the Ukrainian economy was like accelerated by the war. And then there is a second aim of this reconstructing program of Ukraine, that in a way the way how the money is lent to the Ukraine has a very specific form. Today there is this interest subsidy in Ukraine. That means that the money that is lent by the European Union to the Ukraine, the interests are not be paid by Ukraine. The interests are paid by the European Union. That means that the Ukraine can have an access to money that is easier. But that means also that if the Ukraine government will change social regulation after the war in Ukraine, the European Union can also abolish this interest subsidy. So that means that the Ukraine has to pay back also the interests of the loan. So if there are some progressive transitions in Ukraine, even then there is a huge possibility of a large indebtedness of the Ukrainian government, of the Ukrainian state, and then the intervention also of international financial institutions like the IMF, with programs, conditions like we see today in Tunisia, we see today in Argentina, and we see also in Sri Lanka. Like, so this is like the way of how the West is seeing the reconstructing and the rebuilding of Ukraine. So there is like a way of perpetuating and normalizing the state of emergency of financial blackmail in the Ukraine. And Michael Roberts summarizes that what the West is doing through the Ukrainian government is to create a capitalist free market economy within the European Union and backed by NATO armory. So there is like this idea of rebuilding Ukraine. And what we see also, like what we see in Ukraine, like the situation in Ukraine anticipates the deregulation tendencies all over the world. I think this is also a characteristic of war economy, that what is already proved and made in a war situation can be also in a way applied in other territories. And I think that the European Union above all, but not only, is like living such conditions with strong deregulations, strong precarizations of working and living conditions. Now, what we are also seeing is like the pressure from the NATO and the US on Europe to integrate Europe much more in this war situation. There is an article written by Wolfgang Streeck. It's a German sociologist and philosopher. He wrote this contribution which has the title "A Bipolar Order," and he's asking if there is like this tendency of a bipolar world order after with the war in Ukraine and after the war in Ukraine. And in this article, he's highlighting like the role, above all, Germany is having in creating Europe as subordinated to NATO policies. There are some examples that are really impressive. There is like, for example, all the discussion about the demand of NATO to have huge expenses in military of at least 2% of the GDP all over the world now is already old. This 2% of minimum expenditure for military is already like, we are already on a step forward, and we are talking about 2.5%. So there is like this pressure to increase military expenditure, and Germany is one of the main countries that made huge investments for the rearmament of the country. Then there are also other ways of military integration of Europe in this war. There is, for example, the idea, or there is also the plan, and they are working already in that American M1 Abrams tanks should be like brought to Germany, and in this military bases, German military bases, where American tanks US American tanks are brought, the Ukrainian crews should be trained. So there is also like a territorial integration of Europe in this war. And there is a third way of integrating Europe in this war, and above all Germany. It's like that Germany's leading armament company, Rheinmetall, is opening a tank factory in Ukraine, where 400 battle tanks of the newest generation will be produced every year. So if you remember what we said before, that there are no labor rights anymore, that there are no trade unions anymore in Ukraine, and you have like German capital investing in Ukraine without these labor laws. We can imagine also what that means for the working people in Ukraine working in these German factories. And these are all signs of like this perpetuating ongoing war in Ukraine. So we can also say there is no interest by the European Union and by the US and NATO to stop this war, to enter into a negotiation for stopping this war. And on the European level, there is a last thing that was decided a couple of weeks ago. It is the so-called Act in Support of Ammunition Production, the so-called ASAP program. That means that the European Union is investing 1 billion euro to produce in a very fast way ammunition for Ukraine. So there is also like this general tendency of having a European common armament industry to support Ukraine in this war. So for summarizing this moment of discussion, it's the European Union is fully integrated in the war by military expenditure, by participating in the training of Ukrainian military, by building armament for the war in Ukraine, by giving also the military bases in Europe to use it in the ongoing war. There is secondly no idea of stopping the war by Europe. There is really this idea of perpetuating war, and this is also reflecting in what Lenin said. Not only like a war that is made externally, but this is totally linked to the class war, to class conflict we are living in the different countries of Europe, because we can see that the attacks on labor rights, the attacks on ecological rights, the attacks on migrant rights are attacked in this context of war economy, with this paradigm of war economy. So the war can be used as an argument to have a general reconstruction and regulation, social political regulation of today's capitalism. So to come to a conclusion, what is like now today the left doing? How is the left in Europe acting with this general context? I think we can like divide the left in Europe in more or less 4 tendencies. There is one tendency that can be defined as a warmongering left, asking for the militarization of the conflict and the direct intervention of NATO to defend their states. The left having this position, it's above all the Polish left, of course the Ukrainian left, but also the left in the Baltic states. The main argument is that today there is a huger enemy in front of the door of these countries, of the borders, so that we cannot think about the social conflict we are having in these countries. We need to arm these countries, to militarize these countries, to defend them from a next Russian invasion. And I think this is very, very clear. I mean, this is the most tendency inside of, or the leftist organizations and parties sharing these positions are above all, as I said, like the parties in the eastern part of Europe, but also like the social liberal parties, the former social democrats, but also the new left in Eastern Europe. This is something very interesting. The same parties and organizations that in the last decades struggled and fought against the fascistization, the Nazification of their countries, and I think about Poland, I think about Hungary, I think about other countries in the left. Today, they are supporting their national bourgeoisie in the argument that they need to protect their country against the Russian invasion, as if the Russian invasion is next. Tomorrow, there will be, after Ukraine, there will be Poland. After Poland, there will be Hungary, and so on and so on. And so, or the Baltic states. So we can identify this left also in what Lenin is defining in this pamphlet of 1915 as the social chauvinism of the people arguing today in the defense of the fatherland against like an external foreign intervention. The problem is that the militarization of these societies, it's not only to protect, of course, the borders of these countries, but it's above all also to fight the internal struggle. So to have a class struggle that is putting under pressure the working class, that is limiting women's rights. We have in Poland, for example, the women who has no access to abortion rights. There was a huge struggle in the last years, and the same organizations that were with this women's movement took into the streets in the last decades, they are today supporting the Polish bourgeoisie against a Russian invasion, a so-called Russian invasion. So there is this left. Then there is a second left. There is a left that is finding itself on at the least common denominator. there are above all three denominators that can be summarized. There is like stop the war actions, the retirement of the Russian troops from the Ukraine territory, and the introduction of negotiations today very quickly. So we can say this is, of course, an advanced position compared to the first one I explained, but there are still some problems in these positions because, for example, this kind of left that is above all represented by the European left, the party of the European left, this is like the party that is organized around the former communist parties of Europe. They are not expressing themselves concretely against sanctions. We know today that sanctions are not useful to stop a regime, to stop an autocratic regime. We see it in different examples. We saw it also in war situations. We saw it, for example, in Iraq. The sanctions that were implemented and introduced in Iraq only produced poverty for the people, only produced a lack of access to healthcare, to medical healthcare, and so on and so on. So the sanctions today also, I think we have to criticize them because they are not a way to lead and to stop a war. And there is also like a very ambiguous position on the warlike role of NATO. Some traditional parties rising from the old communist parties, they are clearly condemning NATO. Others are not condemning NATO and not condemning their warmongering attitude of NATO. So there is like also in this left, they find themselves on the least common denominator, but they do not have really a progressive approach or a progressive demand also on how building peace movement. Then there is a third position that can be in a way defined as a second warmongering left, defending the so-called right of self-defense of Putin, the denazification of Ukraine, and the self-determination of the Donbass. So this kind of left that is very marginal, but I wanted to highlight them because I think there is a tendency all over the world of this kind of left. They are saying the only problem in this war is the NATO expansion in the east. Putin is only having like a defense role in the war. He is not invading Ukraine. He's defending itself against NATO and so on and so on. And I think it is very dangerous to have such an approach because what we find here is like like also a way of mixing tactical and strategical point of views. They are like they're in a way presenting Russia also as a strategical alliance in their point of view for the working class. And I think it is totally wrong. Russia today is not in no way like a strategical alliance and not even a tactical alliance. And this leads me to the fourth position we can find in the left. It is like a left that is looking for an autonomous position, an autonomous working class position that does not feel the pressure to take a position for NATO and the US or for Ukraine, for Russia or even China. It is a left that is trying to develop an autonomous point of view that is putting forward the need to stop the war today because it is like not a progressive war. It is a very reactionary war we are living today that is putting under pressure not only the territories of Ukraine, Donbass, and Russia itself, but all over the world. Europe is having this, is feeling it very directly, but also other territories in the global south. For example, I'm thinking about the African states and countries where, for example, the food supply was limited because of the war. I mean, we know that Ukraine is one of the main producer of wheat. So there is like all these questions. So we need, and we take this position, we try to take this position, this autonomous position that is not stocked between like the two superpowers, but try to develop an autonomous position. And what does it mean in the concrete situation? As I said at the beginning, today we are living a total different situation as Lenin had during World War I. There was at that time a strong socialist movement. There were strong social Democrats and socialist parties. Today we are weakened. The left answers are very weakened. Left parties are very weakened. The labor movement for itself is also very weak. We are on the defensive. We are not attacking for having better situations. We are defending the little rights we still have. And so we have to make, I think, in a revolutionary and in the progressive perspective, we have to work a lot in the peace movement. That means that we have to link pacifism with concrete social demands. Also, Lenin, in this pamphlet I mentioned before, Socialism and War, is criticizing some pacifist movements, asking for a very general demand of peace. Sorry. Of course, it is important that today there are negotiations around the Ukrainian war, but it is also true that peace today is meaning nothing. In contrary, it weakens also our position, because we are convinced that the social struggle is very important, and the criminalization of a war in general and highlighting peace in general is also like putting pressure on the working class, having more radical actions at the workplaces for their social demands. But we have to link the question of peace with social demands. That can be questions of for example, higher salaries. We have in Italy a campaign going on that we are linking directly with the war in Ukraine, the ongoing war in Ukraine, about a legal minimum wage. Italy is one of the only countries that in the last 30 years didn't experience a real salary increase. In the contrary, we had even a diminishing of the salaries. So there is important to give back to the working class, like also a kind of power by having a minimum wage. So we are linking the struggle for a minimum wage also as a way to having fighting against war. We are supporting all the youth movements that are taking to the streets against climate change and against the destruction of Mother Earth. I think also there it is very important to bring in the idea that the fight against climate change is in a way a fight for peace, and for that we need to connect these demands against the climate change with social demands, with the demand for an end of war in Ukraine, and so on and so on. I think, and I want to conclude with that, I think that there are a lot of possibilities today for the left to get in touch with the working class, to create like the social base of a real peace movement that is asking for a peace in Ukraine, but also to link this demand for a peace in Ukraine with a progressive perspective. So not just to defend our national bourgeoisies, not just to defend the state of the art, but to move forward in a progressive way, above all, as I said, for the working classes in Europe and all over the world that are suffering a lot from this war. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your insightful speech, comrade Maurizio. It consisted of things that we cannot hear through international media. I'm quite sure you will talk more and more about the topic if you don't have such a time limitation. Thank you again for your invaluable speech. Now we can have a very brief Sinhala conversion on what we have heard so far. Professor Sumanasi Lenage is there for...
Yeah, I don't think that this audience need a Sinhala translation.
Yeah, I can see today's audience is such a small one. What can we do today, sir?
But as we record this seminar, and put into YouTube, so I think I will give very brief
it is good,
of Mauricio's lecture.
Yeah.
Well, he started with Maurizio පටන් ගත්තේ ලෙනින්ගේ 2015 ලියවුණු සමාජවාදය සහ යුද්ධය කියන ලිපිය ඇසුරින් ඒ අදහස් මාලාව ඉදිරියට ගෙන යාමක් හැටියට තමයි ඔහු මතු කරා. ඔහු කරුණු තුනක් යටතේ තමන්ගේ සැලැස්ම තමන්ගේ කතාව සැලසුම් කරන බව. පළවෙන්න තමයි යුක්‍රේන යුද්ධය ගැන තිබෙන විවිධ අදහස් ඇසුරෙන් යුක්‍රේන යුද්ධය හඳුනා ගැනීම කියන එක. දෙවෙනි එක තමයි විකල්ප විවරණයක් කරමින් යුක්‍රේන යුද්ධය සම්බන්ධයෙන් සාකච්ඡා කිරීම. තුන්වෙනි එක තමයි යුරෝපයේ වම විසින් මේ ප්‍රශ්නය සම්බන්ධයෙන් කුමන ආකල්පයන් කුමන ස්ථාවරයන් ගනු ලැබුවේද කියන එක සාකච්ඡා කිරීම. පළමුවෙන්ම ඔහු යුක්‍රේන යුද්ධය ගැන තියෙන අදහස් සාකච්ඡා කරා. එතෙදිත් ඔහු කරුණු තුනක් වෙන් කළ පෙන්නවා. පළවෙනි එක තමයි යුද්ධය පිළිබඳව තිබෙන මනෝවිද්‍යාත්මක අදහස. මෙයින් කියවෙන්නේ විශේෂයෙන්ම බටහිර රටවල් විසින් කියන කරුණක්. පුටින් කියන්නේ පිස්සු මිනිහෙක්. ඒ නිසා මේ පිස්සු මිනිහා පරාජය කිරීම ඉතාම වැදගත් මුළු ශිෂ්ටාචාරයේ උවමනාව සඳහා කියන වගේ අදහස තමයි පළවෙනි අදහස පෙන්වුම් කරන්නේ. දෙවෙනි අදහස මේකට හාත්පසින්ම වෙනස් අදහසක්. එය ඇත්තටම රුසියාව විසින් විශේෂයෙන්ම පුටින් විසින් කියනු ලබන කරුණු අනුවයි වෙන්නේ. ඒ නිසා මේ යුද්ධය මූලික වශයෙන් යුක්‍රේනය තුළ බිහි වී තිබෙන නත්සිවාදයට විරුද්ධ ප්‍රකාශනයක් හැටියට නිසා මේ යුද්ධයට ආධාර කළ යුතුයි කියන වගේ අදහසක් තමයි ඒකෙන් කියවෙන්නේ. තුන්වෙනි අදහස මගෙන් කියවෙන්නේ විශේෂයෙන්ම එක්සත් ජනපදය සහ නේටෝ කියන රටවල් අනිත් පැත්තෙන් රුසියාව සහ චීනය කියන රටවල් අතර මැදි වුණු යුරෝපීය සමාජයට මේක ඇත්තටම කොහොමද බලපාන්නේ කියන වගේ කරුණක් තමයි මේ තුන්වෙනි අදහසින් පෙන්눔 කරන්නේ. එතකොට ඊට විකල්පයක් ලෙස ඉදිරිපත් කර අදහස් ඔහු සඳහන් කරා එක ඉතාලි ලේඛකයෙකුගේ නම මට ඒ කාර්යයටම පැහැදිලි වුණේ නැහැ. ඒ නම ඉතාලි ලේඛකයෙකුගේ ලිපියක් තියෙනවා. කොහොම අපි බලමු ලිපිය මරුසියෝලව ගෙන්න ගන්න. ඒ ලිපිය භාෂා තුනකින් පළ වී තිබෙනවා. ෆයිනෑන්ෂල් ටයිම්ස් වල ඉංග්‍රීසි භාෂාවෙනුත් ලෙමොන්ඩ් කියන එකේ ප්‍රංශ භාෂාවෙනුත් ඊළඟට ඉතාලියානු නිවුස් පේපර් එකක් මේක පළ කරලා තියෙනවා. බලමු ඒ ලිපිය ගෙන්න ගන්න. ඊට අතිරේකව ඔහු උපුටා දැක්වුවා බ්‍රිතාන්‍ය ජාතික මාක්ස්වාදී ආර්ථික විද්‍යාඥයෙක්. මම හිතන්නේ අපේ මුල්ම අවස්ථාවේ අපේ මාක්ස් පාසල් ඇවිල්ලා කතා කරන සහෝදරේ මයිකල් රොබර්ට්ස්ගේ අදහස් මාලාවල් ඔහු ඉදිරිපත් කරා. විශේෂයෙන්ම මයිකල් රොබර්ට්ස් අවධාරණය කරා යුක්‍රේන යුද්ධය පාවිච්චි කරන්නේ ඇමරිකා එක්සත් ජනපදයේ විශේෂයෙන් යුරෝපයට නව ආයෝජන ප්‍රදේශයක් ලෙස යුක්‍රේනය ගොඩනැගීම සඳහාය කියන කරුණ මූලික වශයෙන් ඉදිරිපත් කරා. මේ නිසා මොහු සඳහන් කරා යුක්‍රේනයේ යුද විනාශයෙන් ගොඩ ගැනීම සඳහා අවුරුද්දකට ඩොලර් බිලියන 48ක් යෙදවීම අවශ්‍යයි කියලා. මේ අනුව මයිකල් රොබර්ට්ස් ඉතාම දැඩි ලෙස අවධාරණය කරේ යුක්‍රේනයේ අනාගත ප්‍රාග්ධන ආයෝජන ස්ථානයක් හැටියට සැලකිල්ලට ගන්න. ඊළඟට යුරෝපයේ යුද්ධය පිළිබඳ තියෙන යුරෝපයේ වාමාංශික අතර යුද්ධය පිළිබඳ තියෙන ටෙන්ඩන්සීස් හතරක් ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් ඔහු දැක්වුවා. මේ හතරෙන් ඔහු ඉදිරිපත් කරේ හතරවෙනි පොසිෂන් එක, හතරවෙනි ආස්ථානය. මූලික වශයෙන් ඔහු කල්පනා කරේ සාම ව්‍යාපාරය සමග, හැබැයි හුදු සාම ව්‍යාපාරයට සම්බන්ධ වෙන්නේ නැතුව සාම ව්‍යාපාරය සමග සමාජ ඉල්ලීම්. මොකද මේ යුද්ධයත් එක්ක විශේෂයෙන් යුරෝපයේ කම්කරු අයිතිවාසිකම් පරිසර විනාශයන් මේ විදිහේ විශාල දේවල් වෙන නිසා මේ අදහස් මතු කරන ගමන් ඔහු යෝජනා කරනවා සමාජ ඉල්ලීම් පරපතල ලෙස සැලකිලිට ගන්න ඕන විශේෂයෙන්ම කම්කරුවන්ගේ අයිතිවාසිකම් පරිසර ආරක්ෂණය පිළිබඳ අයිතිවාසිකම් වගේ. මෙන්න මේ විදිහේ ව්‍යාපාරකින් තමයි අර 1915 ලෙනින් කියපු විදිහේ ශක්තිමත් තත්වයක නෙමෙයි අද යුරෝපීය වම සිටින්නේ. ඒ කාලේ නම් විතාල වාමාංශික පක්ෂ සමාජ ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී පක්ෂ තිබුණා. නමුත් අද එවැනි තත්වයක් නැති නිසා යුරෝපීය වමට මෙන්න මේ ආකාරයෙන් සමාජ ඉල්ලීම් මතු කරමින් ඉදිරියට යෑම තමයි කරන්න පුළුවන් කියන එක තමයි ඔහු හතරවෙනි ස්ථාවරය සහ යම් ප්‍රමාණයකට ඔහු දරන ස්ථාවරය හැටියට ඉදිරිපත් කරනවා. මම හිතනවා මෙතන නවත්තන්නම්. I'll stop at this point and now we can start the discussion, question and answers, and also if you have any comments to be made, that also can be done. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if, even though we have such a small audience, we can have a small discussion on the topic. And I invite audience to ask your question and make your comments on the topic, what we have heard so far. And I kindly request you, please be brief in asking question and presenting your thoughts to the audience. It will be convenient for all of us. Now you can ask question and make your comments.
I think, Maurizio, I will ask a question. One of the positions, when you talk about the position of the left, one is this question of right of self-determination. Kind of Russian-speaking people in Ukraine should have a right of self-determination, and therefore that struggle should be supported. But on the other hand, we can see the same argument from the other side. That is, we have to defend the right of self-determination of Ukraine vis-a-vis Russian invasion. So the question of right of self-determination, I mean, you are used by both sides. On the one hand, we have Russian-speaking people's right of self-determination, but at the national level or international level, we have a right of self-determination of Ukraine against. Right? So how do you sort of connect these two views? That's the first question. And the second question is that many people have developed the concept of proxy war. Although this is a war between Ukraine and Russia, this is actually a war between Russia and the US and NATO countries. So finally, it has turned into a proxy war. And in a proxy way, by defining proxy wars, one American author said that proxy war is the benefits and the decisions are taken not actually by the people who fight in Ukraine, but by some other people. So I think, what do you think about this proxy war concept when it comes to Ukraine-Russian conflict? Well, I'll stop at that point. I think you can answer those questions and later we can...
Yes, thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for making the translation or the summary translated in your local language. Well, yeah, I think it's really like quite complicated also to use the argument of self-determination. But of course, I think there was like we cannot say that the invasion Ukraine was not like going against international law. I think it is very clear that the invasion was like entering a territory, a national territory that was not a Russian one. And but in this perspective, there is like also the right of self-determination of the Ukrainian people, and also like, well, in a way, the right to self-defense, because I think this is also linked to this concept. At the same time, I would say that also the majority Russian-speaking part of Donbass, what they were experiencing in the last 10 years was like a very huge also attack on the rights, on the language rights. After 2014, for example, they couldn't use the language anymore. There was like the increase of the presence of ultra-right and far-right groups which attacked also the Russian-speaking part and the Russian-speaking population. So I think it is like self-determination. I mean, we all agree that there is a right of self-determination, but I think in this situation, self-determination does not mean a lot, in the sense that there cannot be self-determination if the people cannot self-determine the processes and what they really want. The Donbass, for me, it's like it's very, very specific and an example of that you have, in a way, everyone that is speaking of the Donbass, but I have little voices from the people in the Donbass itself bringing like their point of view, like civil society organizations. What are they saying? Trade unions, something like that. This is always someone speaking for them. And this is, I think, a huge or a big problem in this question also of self-determination, or the way that it is used from one side or the other. What we can say, it is clear. I mean, self-determination is something we have to defend. We have it to defend in a very also in a point of view of sovereignty of the people, sovereignty of countries to self-determine on which side they want to be, and so on, under which government. But what I'm seeing today is that there is very few self-determination by the people, neither in the Donbass nor in Ukraine. If we think about like how the labor rights are attacked, how the basic rights of the people are attacked in Ukraine by the Russian invasion, but at the same time also by the Ukraine government dismantling all the rights, I think there is a huge lack of self-determination. So this is one of the big problems. But of course, self-determination can only be organized if you do not have a war situation. So this is also the reason why the war has to be stopped before a real self-determination process can be launched in the Donbass, but also in Ukraine. I think this is very, very clear. And then secondly, concerning the proxy war, I really agree with this kind of description of the war, in the sense that today and since the beginning, the West, at least the US, through NATO above all, were not excluded from this war. Imagine that since the beginning, NATO and US troops and military were in a way supporting also the training of the Ukrainian army and so on. So there was always a presence since 2014, above all, of the Western countries, and I repeat, above all, the US in Ukraine. And it goes on. It is even being even more proxy war than before, because, as I've explained before, the role of Europe, for example, it is going in a situation of subordination of the NATO decisions. What is concerning the military expansions, what is concerning like the role of the military and the armament industry in this war, and so on and so on. So everything is done to perpetuate this war, but not to be involved directly with a Western soldier in the war. And I think this is not done because there is a huge problem for the US, for example, sending troops in Ukraine to support them against Russia. It is a huge problem because they know that would mean this direct involvement in the war would mean that the conflict would be accentuated with a very high risk. We already have today the high risk, but with a practically certainty of like a nuclear war, a nuclear intervention. And then secondly, I think also that there is like a huge problem internally for the US to send troops today to Ukraine, because after what happened in Afghanistan, after what happened in Iraq, there is a way of, or something like a war fatigue in US society that cannot be like that. Even the like all the ideological battle that we are living and we are seeing against Russia, increasing Russophobia and so on, cannot be an argument for a direct intervention of the US.
NATO-politanism. NATO-politanism. I think that is also a useful article to understand the Ukrainian crisis, probably from the fourth position that you have mentioned. Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, you can ask your questions and present your thoughts to audience. I can say Geetika Kai is there. I would like to hear something from your side, if you like.
Thank you. I'm still thinking. Maurizio, thank you for the talk. I learn a lot too. Studying or I teach in the United States, and when I talk to my leftist friends there, they are taking mostly the Russian side, saying that so they are, so you also mentioned that they are defending, or like they didn't start the war. It is the Ukraine who has to, should be the responsible, should be responsible for whatever going on, and they're supporting, and this but again, this balkanization, or this having a separate state is not a new thing in when you think about Europe. I just wanted to ask you, so you also talked about we have to think about, when you talked about Lenin, that we have to think about new slogans, right? I just want to ask you, what could be the position if we take in a kind of thinking of all these perspectives, and you already mentioned some, but I just want to ask you in general, if you could say in few words, what are the slogans that we could take or say that taking aside, when it comes to politics.
Shall I try to answer directly, or do we want?
Yeah, you can answer.
Yeah, I mean, imagine that it's also very complicated to give a direct answer, but I think I try to explain a little bit what we also in Europe in the last 18 months, what went on. Imagine that we had, for example, the day of the invasion, we organized in Italy, but also all over Europe, there were demonstrations against the war. And it was clear that the people being in the street, they were directly against war. They were not taking a position for one side or the other. They knew that there was the Russian invasion, even if Putin was declaring it as a special, I do not remember the term, but the special intervention, to defend the Russian territory from the attacks of NATO, that it was not true, that it was like a military attack on Ukraine. At the same time, the people were really sensitive also on the question from the first day that there is a problem with the role of NATO. That a couple of months before, Macron, the president of France, was saying it is like a dying structure. So why should we still invest in that? And it is a huge discussion also for the strategic autonomy of Europe. There is like this discussion: should we invest in NATO, that we know it is like a structure or an organization led and controlled by the US? Should Europe not be independent and also have like an independent external and military politics, not only following the US? So it was like a discussion. But what we see also, or what we saw in these first days after the invasion of Ukraine, that the NATO became like, the invasion gave a re-legitimation of NATO. In Italy, it was like it was clear, NATO is useless. We do not need it. We are just spending money. We have like, I don't know how many military bases in Italy. Imagine that Italy has even nuclear weapons, like in a way, in our territory. Even Italy always rejected nuclear power and nuclear weapons in Italy by their own government. So it is like, okay, this is this contradiction, but the war situation accelerated the things. And so you have also now people saying, maybe we need a transatlantic alliance. We need a military alliance to defend ourselves, because we are entering again a war period. So maybe we have to strengthen ourselves. And of course, it makes it really hard in this context to have clear positions that are also like heard by the working class against NATO. On the other hand, it is also very difficult to have these positions in the general discursive context. I mean, imagine that Italy or Europe in general excluded Russian artists from I don't know, artists and musical competitions. Russophobia accelerated a lot. Even like one of the most important film festivals in Europe, the Berlin Film Festivals, Zelensky had the opportunity to speak. And I mean, that means that all Europe is listening. And what he's saying is just that we have one big enemy, and Europe has this enemy with the Ukrainian, and it is Putin. So it is like we have to eliminate Putin to end this war. And this makes it very complex also to have like this anti-NATO position without being put in a corner of, okay, if you are against NATO, you are with Putin. So the slogan we used since the beginning was neither with Putin, neither with the NATO. We need an autonomous position. It was the way of asking for negotiations and highlighting all the tentatives are made all over the world for negotiations. You have the proposal from Xi Jinping of China. You have the proposal from Lula from Brazil. And I mean, also Latin America would be a huge discussion about the role of Latin America, because I just, the last weekend, it was like the CELAC European Union meeting in Brussels, that are the countries of the Latin America and the Caribbean with the European Union. And the European Union put pressure above all for one thing. They wanted a common declaration of the CELAC that's condemned the Russian invasion. And of course, the Latin America countries, they said, no, we cannot sign this thing, because it is not in our perspective. We will never, of course, judge in the way you want us to judge Russia. If you are on the door, if you are intervening in every Latin American country, if US imperialism is on the door. And, I mean, this year is like the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine. This is also like, I think we could talk about. So we try really to highlight negotiations. Lula, Xi Jinping, there is also the Pope that made the proposal that is working for peace. And we see that like the governments are just refusing that. So I think we, for having our slogans that are putting in the center the peace, but also the social rights, we have to think in this direction. We have to think how we can create these autonomous positions, how we can build in this autonomous position of the working class. Because if we decide to take one position or the other, we are stuck. We are stuck, and we are always like subordinated, because we have not the force to determine like this the space that we are trying to enter. So we have to create our own space. And of course, today it is difficult. It is we are marginalized with this position, but I think there is no way out of that situation. We are entering a period of war. The Ukraine war is only one. I think there will be like different wars that will explode in the coming years. And so we have to strengthen these positions to be ready also when the next wars are starting. I don't know if I answered your question really, but it's like, yeah.
Thank you, Maurizio, for your answering, and thank you for your questions, Geeta. I think we have enough time for taking other questions and to hear your thoughts on the topic we discussed. You can speak up either in Sinhala or English language. We can use both languages.
But maybe I want to ask a question to the comrade in the US, in Tika. Maybe you, I mean, you're saying you are in the US. I mean, maybe you can also give us back a little bit what there is like the old discussion, because I think, I mean, the organizations we are in a way connected with, they have very strong anti-imperialist positions, and they tend to not condemn the invasion of Russia and so on. And I want to, maybe you can also like give us an opinion how you see this development, how you frame them, and what is the potential of also of such positions.
A difficult question to answer, to represent the left in the United States. Oh, like, this opinion. I'm just reading, and I like, so we have these groups, like I did my PhD at Cornell. So we have this, left, like those who did the unions, and we are still friends, and we always talk about this. But I teach at the Colgate University in New York, Hamilton. So there, I know, like there are Ukrainians, like they are Ukrainian citizens. They are Americans. They have come very early, and they are, but like in this again, like when I talk to them and participating in these discussions, their stance is that they're supporting. Of course, they talk about self-determination is their horizon, right? And then the balkanization, it's like that is not the discussion on, it is not a new phenomenon, and Russia should let go. And they are saying that we need, again, like actually, I also was thinking to ask you this question again. They are saying, so then when I make a critique, or when we make a critique saying that what about the NATO expansion, what about this American imperialism, and they are actually, you mentioned all these things, they are exaggerated, or like they're putting fuel on the war, and it'll keep going because they are supporting the war, right? So they have the money, they put in the capital, the labor, and the discourse. They're creating the discourse again, demonizing Putin as the evil, and that needs to be eliminated. And all these discussions are going on. And actually, New York Times, I read it every morning, that is their stance, right? So they're saying, so they create, like, when I say following the New York Times, they every day they talk about, follow the New York Times, the daily New York Times, you could say like at least 6 or 8 months continuously, they said that, then they had the war, they start the war. But anyway, so coming back to your question, when I listen to this, the Ukrainian or the American Ukrainians in America, they are supporting the positions of Americans, right? Like, so the American position that we need to intervene and let America do whatever they could to eliminate or destroy Putin. And they're talking about, like, in terms of like self-determination is the horizon, as I mentioned. And also there's, when I said this, when I talked about like imperialism and all, in terms of imperialism, they're saying, what about if you're saying this is imperialism, what about Nazi Germany if the America did not involve? And what is this, what is this terms that you're using, like, they should not intervene, and like all the countries, Ukraine should take care of their business, and the Russia take care of their business, the America should not intervene. So those are, I wanted to ask you, what, like, how do we respond? I don't know what to say. I mean, it's especially when it comes to Sri Lanka, even during the war, the LTT was expecting the West would intervene, right? Though at least India would intervene, and we know they didn't. And then, like we're saying, like, you know, it continued, and the Sri Lankan government militarily destroyed the LTT. That's how they won the war. And then you mentioned there is this solution that, you know, you kill the leader, and then the solution will be there, right? And there is a discourse in the newspapers in America, and there are people talking about or limiting the whole discourse to Putin. So this is the problem of Putin, and we need to eliminate him. But anyway, so this, I want to ask you that question: how do we respond when they say we need to? Or like, you know, what do you say, Nazi Germany, if what happened to Jews, if America did not intervene, no other countries did not intervene. So that is what I could say. I mean, in general, the discourse is, so they, of course, you know, like this liberal stance, and almost every day when I was there, like, it's just every day, every week, or every month, all these discussions are happening, and they're collecting money, all these things are happening, you know. But that's the discussion. Again, like, if I say like two things, it's about limiting the whole discourse to Putin, and like evilizing or demonizing him, and also asking the question, like, you know, we need to intervene. What if America did not intervene, and Putin will destroy Ukraine? That's all. I mean, like, the common two things when it comes to American discourse, I could say.
How can I do that?
Now 9:45, I think we can finish the discussion.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to make you host. Sorry.
Okay. Why did you
Like
make
this.
him a host?
Did I?
Why did you make him a host?
Yeah. Maybe I can just shortly answer, and then maybe we can close, because you asked again the question about, like, how do we argue when they say if the US didn't intervene against Nazi Germany, we will all live like in the Nazi world. And I think, I mean, historical comparisons are always very, very complicated. But I think, I mean, what we have to highlight from also there, an independent point of view, of course, it is very complicated to convince the people with this argument, but we need to work on that, because, I mean, generally the people are so bombed by this idea of, like, there is only one evil, it's Putin. There is only one way, the military defeat, and so on. That is also very complicated to just have one quick response to that, and then the people would say, ah, yes, it's true. I think there are mainly 2 points. There is, first of all, what Ukraine is asking. It's like the militarization of the conflict. So they want the weapons. And our point of view is, of course, we do not want to send weapons anywhere, because, first of all, it produces social inequality also inside of our country. I mean, in the first week of the war, like the stock options of the armament industry in Italy exploded. They increased by 100% in 7 days. So it is like, okay, they now know that there is a war going on, and the war will be a long-going war. So they will have money that is invested in this sector. So there will be, like, okay, the money going, the profits increasing in this sector. Secondly, we deliver armaments to this country. We do not know where these weapons are going. I mean, of course, there is the general the general army of Ukraine, but we also know that the general army of Ukraine, the official army of Ukraine, is not just controlled by the Zelensky government. There are important organizations outside of the government that are like fascist organizations, and they are totally involved in this military. And we know also that weapons already that were sent there, they were like lost, so they have them. So at the end of the war, if there will be an end in the next time, we will also have a highly militarized and weaponized society in Ukraine. What does it mean? So it can be like, I don't know, a civil war can explode, and it's not a civil war where the working class has like a leading position. It's not what Lenin meant by convert the imperialist war in the civil war, but it will be like even putting more oppression, having on the working class, having paramilitary organizations, like controlling territories and so on. So it is not like sending weapons is not a guarantee for having a peaceful situation after the war, when Putin will be defeated, if he will be defeated. So this is a second important point. Like the militarization of the conflict will not bring, also because working class positions inside of Ukraine are very weak. We have to see that. I mean, we know that there are organizations, trade unions, communist organizations, anarchist organizations. They are participating in the so-called Ukraine resistance, but they are under order of the official military. They are not independent, autonomous, militarized groups that are like weaponized groups that are fighting against the invasion and against like the oppression of the government. And I mean, the Ukraine government, it's not our friend. This is something that is very clear. So this is also the reason why I do not want to send weapons there. This is why we also really enforce the position no to weapons, European weapons to Ukraine. And then the second thing is linked much more to the development. I think Europe, since the beginning, had no interest to put for negotiations. All the tentatives that were made for negotiations were just like condemned as, judged as not possible, not possible, not possible. If the Ukraine government is so dependent on the West, and the Ukrainian government is dependent on the West, there would be a possibility to say we have to work for negotiations, and we have all the actors all over the world, from Brazil to the Vatican, from the Vatican to China, to the Chinese government, that can in a way bring to negotiations, to stop the war and having a moment of rest to have negotiations. And the fact that this is not done, but the fact that we have today German factories built in Ukraine where tanks are produced, the fact that the German army is training Ukrainian military, shows that the West and also the European Union is putting itself in a perspective of a perpetuation of a war, and we do not know when it will end. So like the approach to ask for a foreign intervention, we have already a foreign intervention first, and secondly, it's not at all guaranteeing a liberation of these territories. I think these are like the main, but of course, now I had like 7 minutes to explain you that. It's difficult to explain it in a few words to the people asking for like, yeah, for peace.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maurizio. I think it is time for winding up session. We have spent about 2 hours now. I have to thanks some parties. Thank you very much for comrade Maurizio Coppola, for sharing your invaluable thoughts, and we hope you to be present here for another time also. We will invite for another time. And then thank you, Professor Maurizio Coppola, for helping in organizing the session and in helping giving a Sinhala conversion for Mauricio's speech. Then I have to thank for the audience, in particular, Comrade Geetika and Professor Sumansiri. You made this session such an interactive session, even though we could not have a big audience today. I think we can wind up for Marx School today, let's meet in Marx School 54. So thank you so much for good night. Good night.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It was really a pleasure for me to be with you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.